The book of Daniel has been under attack, probably from the earliest days of the church, if not before. Because in the book of Daniel, amongst other things, we have the 70-week prophecy. And in the book of Daniel, we see the fulfillment of divine prophecy as it is given in the scriptures. Now, the attack has taken the form of moving the date of Daniel to be much later than it actually was, so that it is then claimed that it's not prophecy at all but history. Daniel, the 70-week prophecy, was given about 450 BC, and the modern pseudo-intellectuals would have you believe, the university scoffers would have you believe, that it was not written till much, much later, and therefore it wasn't prophecy at all but history. And in so doing, they degrade the book of Daniel and the Bible and rob Christians of their comfort and rob people of their salvation. What's going on in the universities, particularly in the theological departments, is a wicked work. One of the masterpieces in defence of the book of Daniel was written by a man called Robert Dick Wilson. And what I'm going to do here is read from his introduction to Studies in the Book of Daniel, a classic defence of the historicity and integrity of Daniel's prophecies. There are other good men who have written about Daniel, but this, according to my experience, is reckoned to be the major work, the masterpiece in defence of the book of Daniel. So I'm going to read to you from his introduction, Robert Dick Wilson's introduction, in which he sets out what he's going to argue in each of the following chapters. There are 18 chapters in part 1, and I think about 8 or 10 chapters in part 2, and I'm just going to read his kind of summaries of the first 18 chapters, and this alone I think will be an encouragement to you. But of course, for the real full encouragement, get the book if you like, and read the book, and you'll be well armed against the stupidity of university college theological lecturers who couldn't find a bowling ball in the bathtub, but will assure you, and will assure the poor suckers that go there, that Daniel is not a reliable history at all, and certainly not prophecy and dubious history. So I'm going to read then for a little while from the introduction. Now, this may not be to everybody's taste, I appreciate. Really what this is a review of his book, well worth reading if you want to defend Daniel from its critics. Of course, you could just take the Bible at face value and leave it at that. That's fine. But if you want to know more, Robert Dick Wilson's the man. And so here I'm going to read for a little while now, perhaps 20 minutes, 25 minutes, from his introduction, in which he describes his arguments in each of the 18 chapters of Book 1. Quote, "This volume is concerned especially with the objections made to the historical statements contained in the Book of Daniel, and treats incidentally of chronological, geographical and philosophical questions. In a second volume, it is my intention to discuss the objections made against the book on the ground of philological assumptions based on the nature of the Hebrew and Aramaic in which it is written. In a third volume, I shall discuss Daniel's relation to the canon of the Old Testament as determining the date of the book, and in connection with this, the silence of Ecclesiasticus with reference to Daniel, the alleged absence of an observable influence of Daniel upon post-captivity literature, and the whole matter of apocalyptic literature, especially in its relation to predictive prophecy. The method pursued is to give first of all a discussion of some of the principles involved in the objections considered in the pages following, then to state the objections with the assumptions on which they are based, next to give the reasons why these assumptions are judged to be false, and lastly to sum up in a few words the conclusions to be derived from the discussion. As to the details of my method, it will be observed that I have sought in the case of every objection to confront it with documentary evidence designed to show that the assumption underlying the objection are contrary to fact. When no direct evidence is procurable either in favour of or against an objection, I have endeavoured to show by analogy or the production of similar instances that the events or statements recorded in Daniel are possible, and that the objections to these events or statements cannot be proved by mere assertion unsupported by testimony. In the first chapter, the inadequacy of the argument from silence to prove that the books of the Old Testament contain misrepresentations is shown by giving a resume of the historical documents of the Hebrews, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians and others in their relations to one another. A careful reading of this summary of the known evidence ought to convince all unbiased judges that an argument from the silence of one document as to events which are recorded in another is usually devoid of validity. In many cases it will be seen that for long periods of time there are no extra-biblical documents whatever. In other cases there is, for long periods of time, no evidence either biblical or extra-biblical. Again, often when documents of the same time are found, they treat of subjects entirely alien to the subjects treated of in the other, and hence have no bearing on the case. Or even when they treat of the same subjects, the narrator look at them from a different point of view, and one will be intentionally silent where the other enlarges upon the topic. Chapter 2 discusses the objections made by Dean Farrar to the very existence of Daniel on the ground that his name is not mentioned on the monuments of his time. Here I show first that it is not to be expected that the Jewish name of Daniel would ever have been used in Babylonian documents, inasmuch as Nebuchadnezzar changed it to Belteshazzar on his arrival in Babylon. Secondly, that the name Belshazzar, under which form the name Belteshazzar might be written in Babylonian, does occur in the Babylonian tablets as the name of several individuals, and that one of these may have been Daniel of our book. Thirdly, that it is difficult to make any possible identification of Daniel, owing to the fact that his ancestors are not mentioned in the Bible. Fourthly, that even if his ancestors were known, he could not be identified from the monuments, because on them the father or grandfather is never mentioned in the case of slaves or even of foreigners, except in the case of kings and their children. And lastly, that it is unreasonable to expect to find the name of Daniel upon the monuments, first, because the names of slaves are rarely mentioned; secondly, because the names of slaves are never found as witnesses, and those of foreigners but rarely; thirdly, because the annals and display and building inscriptions of the kings never mention the names of anybody except occasionally the names of the kings they conquer, of an occasional general, and of the members of their own families. In fact, no better illustration than this of Dean Farrar can be found of the fact that a man, however brilliant as a preacher and as a writer, and however accomplished as a classical scholar, is but a blind leader of the blind when he attempts to speak upon such complicated matters as those which are involved in an introduction to the book of Daniel, without having first mastered the languages and the literature of Babylon and Persia." Unquote. Just pause for a moment to say this. Dick Wilson did that very thing. He spent at least 15 years studying the languages of Babylon, Persia and so forth, and was an expert in those matters. He set himself out at a very early time in his life to spend 15 years on the languages. I think it was 15 years on Old Testament history and 15 years on some other subject, and he really does know what he's talking about. So back to Robert Wilson. Quote, Chapter 3 treats of the silence of other biblical documents and of the monuments as to an expedition of Nebuchadnezzar said by Daniel to be made against Jerusalem in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. It will be noted that in this particular case of the alleged silence of other sources, there is a tacit overlooking of the testimony to this period afforded by the fragments of Berosus, who states that Nebuchadnezzar was in Palestine at the time when his father Nabopolassar died, which according to the Babylonian system of reckoning the years of a king would have been the 3rd year of Jehoiakim. It will be noted, further, that the critics in their allegations of error against the author of Daniel have failed to consider the whole matter of the different ways of reckoning the regnal years of a king, and the different times at which among different nations that year was supposed to begin. This frequently renders it very difficult to determine the corresponding months and years of a king's reign in the different countries, and should make us slow in asserting that the 3rd year of a king in one document might not be the same as the 4th year in another. Unquote. Just pause again. Many of the chronologers will say this. Martin Anstey, Jack Moorman, two of the best chronologers I have found. E. R. Thiel, Edwin R. Thiel, not so reliable in my view, but they will all tell you this, that sometimes it's due to the regnal years and the way they're calculated in different countries that sometimes there's a seeming error in correlation between the Hebrew account and the records of those countries. So let's go back to Robert Dick Wilson, quote, "Again, I show in this chapter that Jeremiah and the books of Kings and Chronicles do not purport to give us a complete history of the times of Nebuchadnezzar, and that, hence, it is not fair to say that an event which is mentioned in Daniel cannot be true because it is not mentioned in these other writings, and further that the monuments of Nebuchadnezzar say nothing definite about his military expeditions, except about one to Egypt in his 37th year, although they do show conclusively that he was king of Syria and many other countries whose kings are said to do his bidding. Lastly, it is shown that in the fragments of his history of Babylon, Berosus supports the statement of Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar made an expedition to Palestine before he was crowned king of Babylon and carried away spoils from Judea which were placed in his temple at Babylon, and that there is no statement made in Daniel about this expedition which is any way controverted by any other direct testimony. Chapter 4 answers a further question connected with the expedition of Nebuchadnezzar against Jerusalem in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, arising from the charge that the author of Daniel made false interpretations of the sources known to him. An examination of the alleged sources of Daniel's information showed that he does not contradict these sources nor make erroneous interpretation of them, but on the contrary it is his critics who, on the ground of their own implications and conjectures, and sometimes of their crass ignorance of geography and of the historical situation, have really manufactured or imagined a case against Daniel. No more astonishing example of the fabrication of evidence can be found in the history of criticism than the use which is made of the statements of the Old Testament with regard to Carchemish, in order to show that Nebuchadnezzar cannot have moved against Jerusalem as long as this fortress was in the hands of the Egyptians. The critics of Daniel have assumed not merely that the Egyptians had Carchemish in their possession, but also that it lay on the way from Jerusalem to Babylon, so as to cut off, if in an enemy's hands, a possible retreat of Nebuchadnezzar from Palestine to Babylon. A knowledge of the position of Carchemish and of the lines of traffic from Damascus to the Euphrates should have precluded them from statements so unscientific from a geographical and military point of view. Chapter 5 investigates the use of the word for king, especially in the Semitic languages. This discussion shows that Nebuchadnezzar may have been called king before his father's death, and will serve also as an introduction to the discussion of the kingship of Belshazzar and that of Darius the Mede, in that it illustrates that there might be two kings of the same place at the same time. Chapter 6 considers the objections made to the book of Daniel on the ground of what it says in regard to Belshazzar. Here it is shown that Belshazzar, the son of Nabonid, often referred to as Nabonidus, I say aside here, back to Dick Wilson, quote, "Here it is shown that Belshazzar, the son of Nabonid, may, according to the usage of those times, have been also the son of Nebuchadnezzar, that there is a good reason to suppose that he was king of the Chaldeans before he became king of Babylon, that he may have been king of Babylon long enough to justify the writer of Daniel in speaking of his first year as king of that city, that the fact that he is not called king elsewhere by his contemporaries is simply an argument from silence, paralleled by other instances, and that neither the biblical sources outside of Daniel nor the monuments say that any man other than Belshazzar was last de facto king of the city of Babylon. In short, it is shown that the evidence fails to substantiate the assertion that the statements of Daniel in regard to Belshazzar are false. Chapters 7 to 13 treat of all the questions that have been raised concerning Darius the Mede and the Median Empire, showing that if we identify Darius with the Gubaru of the inscriptions, there is no objective reason for denying the truth of the biblical statements with regard to him. It is shown that Darius may have been the name of a Mede, that he may have been the son of a man called Xerxes, that is Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, that he may have reigned at the same time as Cyrus and as sub-king under him, that he could have appointed 120 satraps over his kingdom, even though it was restricted to Chaldea and Babylonia alone, that he may have had a den of lions, containing lions sufficient to have devoured the conspirators against Daniel and their families, that he could not have been a reflection of Darius Hystaspes, or any one or all of the Persian kings of the name Darius. In short, that, granting that Darius the Mede had two names, for which supposition there is abundant evidence from the analogy of other kings, there is no ground for impugning the veracity of the account of Darius the Mede as given in the book of Daniel. To particularise, it is shown in chapter 7 that it is pure conjecture to suppose that the author of Daniel thought that Darius the Mede preceded Cyrus the Persian as king of Babylon, or that Cyrus succeeded to the empire of Babylon on the death of the Median Darius. Further, it is shown that Darius the Mede may have had a second name, Gubru, or Gobrias, and that he probably received the government of Chaldea and Babylon from Cyrus. Chapter 8 treats of the statements of Daniel with regard to the part taken by the Medes and Persians respectively in the conquest of Babylon, and shows that they are in harmony with the monumental evidence. Chapter 9 discusses the allegation that the author of Daniel was deficient in knowledge and confused in thought in the statements which he makes with regard to the Persian Empire, especially with regard to the names and number of its kings, the absolute rulership of Darius the Mede, and the division and number of its satrapies. Chapter 10 answers the assumption that Darius the Mede has been confused with Darius Hystaspes, because each of them is said to have organised his kingdom into satrapies. It is shown that the satrapies, or satrapies, varied so in extent that there may easily have been 120 of them in the dominions over which Darius the Mede was made king, and that Darius Hystaspes did not originate the government by satraps, since the Assyrian monarchs, especially Sargon II, had organised their possessions in the same manner. Chapters 11 and 12 treat of the assumption that Darius the Mede is a reflection of Darius Hystaspes. Just pause there for a moment again, unquote. Darius Hystaspes comes later. Darius the Mede was the first one to take the kingdom, as we read in the book of Daniel. Darius Hystaspes is a later king, about 3 or 4 kings later on. He's one and the same with Ahasuerus of the book of Esther, and is one and the same with Artaxerxes of the book of Nehemiah. Back to Dick Wilson, quote, by a careful comparison of what Daniel says about Darius the Mede with what is known from all sources about Darius Hystaspes, the evidence is given to show that whatever else Darius the Mede may have been, he cannot have been a reflection of Darius Hystaspes. In chapter 11 I discussed the names and families of the two kings, showing that in these particulars Darius the Mede cannot have been the reflection of Darius the Persian. Chapter 12 shows how the two kings differ in the age and manner of their becoming king, in the names and extent of the kingdoms over which they ruled, in their relation to other kings, in their methods of government, and in their personal characteristics. Chapter 13 treats of the alleged confusion by the author of Daniel of Xerxes and Darius Hystaspes, and of his further alleged confusion of this alleged confused Xerxes Darius with Darius Codomanus. It treats further of the alleged belief of the author that there was a triumphant repulse by Alexander the Great of an attack on Greece by this confused Xerxes Darius Hystaspes Codomanus. Chapter 14 gives the latest evidence to show that Susa, in the time of Daniel's vision, was in all probability a province of the Babylonian Empire. Chapter 15 gives the latest evidence from the monuments and from medical science, tending to confirm the historicity of all the statements made in Daniel about the fact, the character and the duration of the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 16 discusses the theory that the edicts of the king are impossible. I here show that those edicts cannot be called either morally, legally, physically or historically impossible. That they are not morally impossible is shown from analogy by the edicts of the Roman emperors and by the tenet of the Roman hierarchy that the church may justly inflict on heretics the penalty of death, and also by a study of the character of Nebuchadnezzar as revealed in his monuments and of Darius the Mede as revealed in Daniel, in comparison with such tyrants as Henry VIII of England, Philip II of Spain and Louis XIV of France. That they are not legally impossible is shown by a review of what is known of the laws of ancient Babylon and Persia, That the execution of these decrees were not physically impossible is shown by numerous examples of similar cases given in the histories of Assyria and Babylonia. Many examples prove the commonness of burning in the fire as a method of punishment. The possibility of the destruction of the 120 satraps and their families by lions is shown from the fact that the monuments of the kings of Assyria say that they had menageries containing, quote, all the animals of the mountains and of the plains, unquote, including elephants, panthers and lions. Further, it is shown that lions at that time were the pest of the Euphrates Valley, hundreds of them being killed in a single hunting expedition, and that in one case mentioned by Ashurnasirpal, king of Assyria, 50 young lions were captured alive and shut up by him in the city of Kalak. Finally, assertion there is an historical impossibility involved in the decrees recorded in Daniel is shown to be the baseless fabric of the critic's imagination, inasmuch as of the many decrees which the monarchs of Babylon and Persia must have made, only one or two have come down to us. The opinion of certain men today that these decrees could not have been made must yield to the positive evidence. To deny the historical possibility of the decrees is a pure case of opinion versus evidence. Chapters 17 and 18 discuss the possibility of the use of the word Chaldean in the 6th century BC to denote the wise men, or a part of the wise men of Babylon, and the relation in which Daniel stood to these wise men. The evidence gathered together in these chapters shows that there is no sufficient reason for denying that the word Chaldean, to denote a class of Babylonian wise men, may have been employed as early as 600 BC, unquote. That's, of course, 150 years before the 70-week prophecy, according to Scripture. Quote, nor for denying that a strict Jew may have been a member of the class of Babylonian wise men to which Daniel is said to have belonged. The use of the words for wise in all the Semitic languages proves that the term is always used in an honourable sense, and that it is a groundless supposition of the critics that any blame was ever attached by the writers of the Old Testament or by the Jewish scribes to any class of real wise men to whatever nation they may have belonged. And then Mr. Wilson sums up thus: hoping that this volume may confirm the faith of any wavering ones in the historicity of a book which was so highly prized and so often quoted by our Lord and his apostles, and that it may show particularly to men who have due regard for the laws of evidence how flimsy are the grounds on which some would reject the testimony and impugn the veracity of the writer of Daniel, I send it forth upon its mission in the world. If it shall have served no other purpose, it has at least accomplished this: it has convinced the writer that the methods pursued by many so-called higher critics are illogical, irrational, and unscientific. They are illogical because they beg the question at issue. They are irrational because they assume the historic facts are self-evident and that they can set limits to the possible. They are unscientific because they base their conclusions on incomplete inductions and on a practical claim of omniscience. Before closing my introduction, a few words ought to be said about the sources from which I've derived my evidence. Generally, it will be observed that I have appealed to the standard editions of text in the original languages in which they are written. When there exist good translations, as in the case of some of the classical historians, I have made free use of these translations, always. However, after comparison with the original texts. In the case of others, I have secured as good versions as possible. My son, Philip Howard Wilson, died June 27, 1913, honour man in classics of the class of 1911 at Princeton University, being responsible for many of the translations from the classical writers whose works have not yet been rendered into English. In the case of Assyrian and Babylonian documents, I have made use where possible of the Colin Schriftliche Bibliothek, excuse my pathetic German pronunciation, denoted by KB, translating from the German version, revised in the light of the transliterated Assyrio-Babylonian text. In doubtful and important connections, I have consulted the original texts so far as they are published. This method has been pursued also with all other original documents, that is, I have used the best version available, but always in comparison with the original text. And then Dick Wilson gives his thanks to various pastors and professors who had been of some assistance. And that introduction was written in Princeton, New Jersey in April 1917. Dick Wilson died in 1930. And maybe, just maybe, that's whet your appetite for the whole book, because of course all he's done there is give us the headings of the things he discusses and argues in detail. It's a masterpiece, and I highly recommend it.